Hello everyone. Halloween is coming, and I have prepared a few stories for you tonight. So we will start with Something's Wrong. Hello?
You will die in 7 days.
I think you dialed the wrong number.
Oh, sorry.
Hello?
What's your favorite scary movie?
Hey, what's up? Listen, I'm in the middle of something right now.
Okay, no problem, man. I'll try you again later.
Hello?
Would you like to play a game?
No, but it doesn't even make any sense.
What doesn't make sense is that you didn't check the living room yet.
We're good now, and you don't need to worry, there is not going to be any more surprise. It is now storytelling time. We're going to begin our night with an overview of alchemy. I guess you've heard about these people searching for a scientific or magical way to turn lead into gold. But what is it exactly? What is the Philosopher's Stone? And how does alchemy relate to actual chemistry? We'll find out. And then we will go to the eerie island of Hashima in the south of Japan. It's a ghost town. These stories may be a bit creepy, but you don't need to worry at all. You are perfectly safe, and you can let yourself go and sleep anytime. There are timestamps in the first comment if you wish to resume the story later. And as always, you can perfectly follow along with your eyes shut, as the visuals are optional to understand the stories. In case you wish to download and keep this video, or just the audio, you can from my Patreon page. There is a link in the description. So for now, just adopt a comfortable position and get ready for the ride. We're going to begin with the history of alchemy. What is alchemy? If you live in a Western country, it evokes European scholars or charlatans, sometimes depending on the point of view, from the Middle Ages or the modern period, practicing a mix of science and magic to transmute elements or manipulate the forces of nature. This is not wrong, but alchemy is way more ancient and broad than that. It is also a tradition that dates back to the antiquity, that existed on various continents, and that may be an esoterical practice, but it also played a role in the birth of modern science. So before we take a look at the past few centuries and famous European alchemists like Nicolas Flamel or Paracelsus, we're going to return to the origins of Western alchemy, and this brings us to Egypt in the first few centuries. Egypt, and especially Alexandria, was a Roman province where several cultures mixed in the first centuries: Egyptian, Roman, and Greek. Western alchemy was born there when several factors combined to create a new field of experimentation and research. First, there was the knowledge of Egyptian goldsmiths. For centuries, millennia even, they had perfected metalwork. They knew of alloys and how to gild metals. There was also the Greek theory that matter was unified, that everything material was made of the same substance that could take a different aspect and different characteristics depending on the qualities imposed to it. The Greeks had many theories about matter. They had had the intuition that matter was made of discrete units. Actually, the word atom, atomos in Greek, was coined 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. and it was a philosophical concept at the start. There is a philosopher called Democritus who is credited for elaborating this theory. He thought that all matter was made of tiny particles that were eternal, and that the qualities of an object depended on the kind of atoms it was made of. This was just an intuition and a theory that could not be verified through experimentation. But it proved rather pertinent when the existence of atoms could finally be proven in the 19th century. It was not perfectly accurate neither, because we know that atoms are not the smallest particles and they can be broken, but they are the smallest particles that define an element. The Greeks were not the only ones to come up with this intuition. Actually, there was a similar theory that also appeared in ancient India. A competing or complementary vision of what matter was in ancient Greece was the theory of elements. Several philosophers developed the concept of basic elements: earth, water, air, fire, and sometimes also a fifth one called ether. They supposed that every material thing was made of a combination of these basic elements, and that changes in the blend of elements explain the different characteristics of objects. This was certainly a good observational theory based on the objects they had around them. They noted, for example, that metals came from earth and could be, it seemed, mixed with fire or altered in water due to rust, or that plants and wood in general apparently grew from earth, absorbing air and water. Even though this theory of elements no longer has a place in modern science, because the atomic theory has replaced it, there was this belief in the possibility to modify matter, to change its state into a new one. And there was yet another Greek theory, the theory of universal sympathy. It was the idea that all elements in the cosmos are linked and have mutual attraction or repulsion, so that discovering these rules may allow to modify the state of matter and transmute an element into another. It is the meeting in the same place of Egyptian metalwork, glasswork, and advanced craftsmanship in general, with these Greek theories or intuitions about matter that gave birth to alchemy. Alchemy at the start was an attempt, a set of practices to transform elements into others. We call this chemistry today, and it is based on scientific experimentation and rather different theories about the nature of matter, a different understanding of what matter is. But in this sense, alchemy is an ancestor of chemistry. The oldest documents we know of about alchemy are papyrus written in Greek in the 3rd century, and they contain recipes to give certain metals the aspect of gold or silver, to create gems from cheaper ingredients, or to imitate purple dyes. In the antique Mediterranean, purple was a very rare and precious kind of dye. It came from mollusks, and it was hard to find, which is why it was expensive and associated with luxury and power. Powerful Romans wore purple, and the association of this dye with authority lasted much longer. Royal coats, or even today, the robes that Catholic or Anglican cardinals wear are purple. These first alchemy recipes are somewhere in between esotericism and technique. Many of them are jewelers' recipes to gild cheap metals or to reduce the quantity of gold in an alloy without altering too much its appearance. Alchemy did not spread much outside Greco-Roman Egypt during the Antiquity, but even before, a similar practice with a different angle had appeared in Oriental civilizations. In India, for example, there is a branch of Ayurveda, the traditional Indian medicine, which is centered around the manipulation of mercury to try to extend life and maybe even become immortal. There was also a tradition in Hinduism establishing a connection between eternal life and gold, and various writings about the transmutation of mercury into gold. In ancient China, too, there was a field of research that appeared at least in the 1st century BC, so we are various centuries before this Greco-Egyptian alchemy. And Chinese alchemy centered around the search for an elixir of immortality, or one that could cure any disease. It can be associated with alchemy because it is based on the ingestion of modified elements such as gold. Chinese alchemists believed that it was possible to reinforce or develop the properties of natural elements by transforming them through burning or roasting, and by combining them too. They may not have discovered the elixir of immortality, but their research led to some discoveries, probably by accident. An important one is black powder. It is not 100% sure, but it may have been discovered accidentally when trying to mix ingredients to observe the outcome. Even though alchemy cannot really be called science, because its foundations are not provable by experimentation, the physical link between gold and immortality, for example, or all the symbolism attached to elements are more in the category of beliefs. But still, it participated in discoveries, and it was a field of research that produced emulation and helped form new questions. Black powder, for example, became extremely useful. It was used in fireworks in China in the 10th century, and then in cannons by the 13th century, and from China it spread to the rest of the world, to Japan, the Mongols, the Muslim world, and finally to Europe, where it became used massively and was perfected. So in various civilizations, a practice centered on attempts to transform elements to create wealth or for health purposes had appeared. The Greco-Egyptian school of alchemy survived the fall of the Roman Empire and the end of the Antiquity because it passed to the Islamic world. Many techniques and concepts in philosophy from the Greeks and the Romans passed to the Islamic world. Some of them also survived in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, but Muslim scholars were very important in the transmission of this heritage from the antiquity, because they translated massively to Arabic, and many antique documents were lost in Byzantium. They are known to us today only because they could be translated back from Arabic during the Middle Ages or the modern period. And Muslim scholars also kept alive several fields of research, and they added new discoveries to them, including alchemy. Actually, the word alchemy comes from Arabic alchemia, which became alchimia in medieval Latin, then alchemy with a Q in Old French, and this gave the English word alchemy. But this tradition of alchemy that Islamic scholars came into contact with was very magical and esoterical. What they added to it was a lot more experimentation and what we could call an early scientific methodology. There is an author from the 8th century called Jabir Al-Hayyan. It is unclear whether he was a single person or maybe several persons writing under the same name, because he produced so many writings in different fields that it's hard to believe this is the work of a single person. But anyway, he is one of the persons credited for giving birth to modern chemistry, because he advocated experimentation in a laboratory and practical work. Earlier alchemists from the antiquity really just invented formulas out of nowhere or based on the symbolism they attached to elements. He, or they, if there were several, believed in experimentation, and that asserting things that had not been experimented was not actual knowledge. It doesn't mean he was a chemist either, because he also attributed symbolic qualities to metals or other elements. He also adopted the elemental system from the Greek tradition. This belief that there were 4 or 5 base elements: air, earth, fire, water, and ether. And he added new ones: sulfur and mercury. This elemental theory, with now 6 or 7 different base elements, passed to European alchemists in the Middle Ages. But it didn't go without critics in the Islamic world. Jabir's works were from the 8th century, and in the following centuries various alchemists searched for recipes in the entire Muslim world that now spread from Spain to Southeast Asia. But many scholars criticized alchemists on the basis that it was just superstition, that it didn't work, and that it was impossible to turn one metal into another to achieve this transmutation. Anyway, it is during the 11th or 12th centuries that alchemy books were translated from Arabic to Latin and reached medieval Europe, like many other writings in different disciplines: history, mathematics, philosophy. We are not talking about a quick and massive inflow of knowledge and information into Europe, because books were handwritten. It took a lot of time to copy a book, and even more to translate one. Access to these handwritten books was also limited to a very small circle. But alchemy progressively made its way into the academic world in European universities, together with disciplines that appear to us a mixed bag. There were mathematics, philosophy, theology, or medicine, but also astrology or alchemy. It is also how new words from Arabic were introduced into European languages, like alcohol or elixir. Instead of becoming one unified discipline, alchemy was studied by various persons who each interpreted it. Among them there was Albertus Magnus in the 13th century. He was a German Dominican friar and later a bishop. He believed in the transmutation of metals, that, for example, lead could be turned into gold, and also that metals or stones grew from earth, a bit like a fetus. Another important figure in the 13th century is Roger Bacon, an English philosopher and alchemist. Roger Bacon is an important figure in the development of science because he emphasized the study of nature and physical phenomena through empiricism, through experimentation. This sounds almost obvious to us, I guess, but it took a mental revolution to admit this principle. In the antiquity, experimentation was not even a concept. There was no interest or belief in the idea that constructing an artificial situation was a valid way to discover the laws of nature. Aristotle and many other Greek philosophers made hypotheses based on their observations and their intuitions, but they absolutely never tried to validate them in an experiment. They thought that the truth could emerge thanks to discussion, thanks to the confrontation of ideas, or through intuitions that individuals could have a connection to the laws of nature because they were a part of it, and that they could discover this knowledge that was already inside them. The very concept of creating an experiment artificially would have sounded absurd to them. So, like Jabir Ibn Hayyan and others who would multiply in the following centuries, Roger Bacon participated in this very slow change of paradigm in the Western world, the birth of experimental science. In the late medieval period in Europe, 13th and 14th centuries, the one intellectual figure that dominated natural science and philosophy was Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. And with him came the elemental theory, the idea that there were these few base elements that were the components of all objects. Bacon had the nerve to apply empirical testing to Aristotle's theories and predictions too, and he realized that his results were different and unexpected. This gave a lot of material to think about, and it led to new theories and new discoveries. The quest all these alchemists were pursuing also came from the antiquity, the transmutation of metals and the use of modified elements to extend life. Medieval alchemists picked up from the antiquity the belief in the existence or the possibility to discover something called the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone was not supposed to be an actual stone, but rather a substance that could be at the same time able to turn metals into gold, to rejuvenate or give immortality, and even cure illnesses or create lamps that burn eternally. For alchemists, the Philosopher's Stone came to represent a form of perfection in their field of investigation, like an ideal of enlightenment that they had to try to reach. Of course, it was never discovered, as far as we know, and the idea that such a substance with universal properties exists looks a bit weird, little credible to us. But the understanding of nature was deeply different in the Middle Ages. The fields of science and magic were not separated and well defined or distinguished like they are today. And also the myth of the Philosopher's Stone was already very ancient. There were writings from the 3rd century that already mentioned it. When an idea has been around for such a long time, it gives it a varnish of credibility. It is easier to think that there may be at least some truth to it, however unproven it is. The creation of this Philosopher's Stone, the alchemical method, was known as the magnum opus, or the great work. Many alchemists have claimed or have been credited for the accomplishment of it, of the great work, leading them to the ultimate discovery. And all sorts of theories have been elaborated to describe the Philosopher's Stone. A consensus formed to say that it looked like an orange powder, or a red block, transparent and glass-like, a bit like a ruby. It would have been heavier than gold and incombustible too. Others argued that the Philosopher's Stone was not an actual physical object, but rather a concept or a geometrical figure. Alchemy was limited to a very small circle in the 13th century, but it grew bigger in the 14th, and so did the critics of it. I told you earlier that alchemy had been criticized in the Islamic world, and so it was in Christianity from the end of the Middle Ages. The Church sometimes condemned alchemists because they could be suspected of being magicians or creating fake money, but there was never any general condemnation of alchemy by the Catholic Church, and actually many alchemists were also members of the clergy, which was normal at the time, because monasteries were the places where books could be found, and also where they could be produced. So they also served as centers of knowledge, and they had the largest libraries. But in the 19th century, this myth appeared around the persecution or the condemnation for heresy of alchemists by the Church. This is more of a recreation by occultists who claimed they were the heirs to medieval alchemy. And they contributed to create this Gothic figure of the hidden alchemist searching in secret for the Philosopher's Stone because he is persecuted or he owns dark secrets. It is true that the Church in the Middle Ages and even later watched scholars, universities, all writings to ensure that nothing went against the dogma or its teachings. But alchemy didn't particularly stand out as a subversive discipline. Actually, more serious critiques came from other scholars or other intellectuals, like Dante, the Italian poet, or Geoffrey Chaucer, an English author. They openly called alchemists thieves and liars, because of course with the promise of eternal life or incomparable wealth, many charlatans appeared, and they tried to sell recipes or get funding to pursue some undescribed research. Another well-known figure of medieval alchemy is a French scribe and manuscript seller called Nicolas Flamel. But his reputation as an alchemist appeared way later, after his death, in the 17th century, and it seems he was only a wealthy dealer of manuscripts. He lived in the 14th and beginning of the 15th century. I told you earlier that most manuscripts were copied by monks and kept in monasteries. But at the margin, there was also a small market for manuscript sellers, only for a small circle of wealthy bourgeois and nobles, people who could read and afford to have a library, or wished to offer these manuscripts as presents. They contributed to disseminate non-religious literature, such as the first novels, for example, before printing gave the book-selling industry a completely different dimension. Nicolas Flamel was such a seller of manuscripts that he copied himself or paid other people to copy, and he was a dealer. 2 centuries after his death, in the 17th century, maybe because his life was well documented and his house still existed, also maybe because he was quite wealthy, he developed a reputation as an alchemist who had discovered the Philosopher Stone and achieved immortality, which would mean he would still be walking among us. But he had a tombstone, anyway, which is kept in Paris at the Cluny Museum, and one of his houses, because he owned several, still exists in the center of Paris. This house was completed in 1407 and is probably one of the oldest houses in Paris. The reason for its existence is that it was made of stone when most medieval houses in Paris were made of wood. Alchemy did not recede with the end of the Middle Ages, quite the opposite actually, and once again it remained somewhere at the frontier between magic and science into the Renaissance and the modern period. Another well-known figure that illustrates this is Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a Swiss physician and astrologer and also alchemist from the Renaissance. He was a major actor in what is called the medical Renaissance or the medical revolution of the Renaissance. This period generally evokes more innovations in architecture, in technology, in the arts, the exploration of the world, the spread of the printing press, but there was a broad movement towards the acceleration of how knowledge spread, and it touched many fields of knowledge, sometimes in the continuity of the medieval period, and other times on a completely new basis. When it comes to medicine, changes started in the 15th century, at the start especially in Italian cities like Florence. Medieval medicine could help alleviate pain sometimes with plant-based remedies, and it could practice a bit of surgery too, but it was not clearly distinguished from magic, and judging by the life expectancy, it was not particularly good at keeping people alive neither. Actually, around the world, from China to Europe, or India to America, life expectancy was about the same and way lower than it is today. It was around 25 years in average, because there was a lot of infant mortality. For people who made it into adulthood, it was about 40 years. Life expectancy really took off in the 19th century, when the principles of hygiene, microbial life, antibiotics, vaccines, and various drugs were discovered. The Renaissance period is a prelude to this. Big progress was made in the field of anatomy, because culture and church control of the teachings of the medical profession had made it very difficult to practice dissection before. It became easier, and the understanding of how the human body works improved. surgical instruments were invented too. It was also the beginning of autopsies and their use in forensic and health purposes. Overall, people did not live much longer than they had before, but these discoveries, and maybe even more the change in paradigm with the separation between medicine and magic, all of this paved the way for later discoveries that did make a difference. So Paracelsus was one of these scholars of the Renaissance who were into various disciplines at the same time, like Da Vinci, and he was a physician who pioneered in several aspects of this medical revolution. And at the same time, he was an astrologer and an alchemist. It would be hard to call him a scientist in the modern sense, because at the same time he experimented on the one hand, and also on the other hand he injected a lot of metaphysics and supernatural in his writings. But on the long road that led to the separation between alchemy and chemistry, he was an important figure, and he also had a few intuitions that proved very pertinent later, among many others that were abandoned. For example, he tried to understand and extract the active ingredients in drugs that worked. You know that various remedies known for centuries and generally based on plants already were known in the Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Their knowledge was transmitted from generation to generation. But the reason why they worked, or the particular component of the plant that worked, were completely unknown. Paracelsus thought, rightly, that this was due to an active principle, an active substance, and he tried to extract it. For example, willow bark and willow leaves contain salicylic acid, a molecule close to aspirin, and the use of willow leaves and bark as a painkiller or against fever had been known since the antiquity. This is another example where the practice of alchemy was fruitful indirectly, not really because transmutation of metals was discovered, but rather because the study of matter and elements could inspire new approaches into other fields of research. Paracelsus lived in the 16th century, and 2 generations later, another alchemist called Jean-Baptiste Van Helmont opened the door to the discovery of the existence of gases. This is another thing we consider as obvious today, but it wasn't to our ancestors, because the gas they breathed, the air, or steam, vaporized water, were invisible. Jean-Baptiste Van Helmont wanted to prove that the elemental theory in alchemy, with earth, water, air and fire, was not valid. So he cultivated a tree in a wooden box containing only 200 pounds of soil, of earth, and a young tree. He added only water for 5 years, and then he observed that the tree had gained 150 pounds, but the soil had lost only a few ounces. So because he didn't know that the tree had been able to transform gas, carbon dioxide, into wood, he supposed that the tree was made of water, the only element he thought had been added to the box. Wood was seen as coming from earth, so it meant that water could transmute into earth, and if water could transmute into earth, then earth was not a base element. This intrigued a lot of people and led to many other hypotheses, including the right one. We are surrounded by gas, and matter can have different states independently from what it is. It can be solid, liquid, or gas. So, once again, alchemists did contribute to make knowledge advance, and at the time the definition of what science is was still barely emerging. Another example of someone who had one foot in science and the other in esotericism was Tycho Brahe. He was a Danish astronomer, an alchemist and an astrologer. Very much like chemistry and alchemy were not precisely separated, astronomy and astrology often had the same practitioners. The fact that Tycho Brahe believed in astrology and alchemy too did not stop him from searching for empirical facts when it came to the study of stars. In the 16th century, he made the most accurate astronomical observations of the time, and to do so, he built large astronomical instruments. He was born from a Danish noble family, but later he went into exile from Denmark and he joined the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. And in Prague he was assisted by a young astronomer and also astrologer, Johannes Kepler, who is probably more famous than his master because he established laws that describe the motion of planets around the Sun. Still late in the 17th century, many scholars or scientists were into what we regard as several disciplines at the same time. They were called natural scientists. The most famous of them is probably Isaac Newton, who is most remembered for his work in mathematics, optics, and of course physics, the theory of gravitation. But even Newton was not exclusively into hard science. He also devoted time to translate alchemy books and may have spent time studying them. It isn't clear whether he took this seriously or did it out of curiosity. But the burgeoning scientific world at the end of the 17th century had not really rejected alchemy yet. What astrologers and maybe even more alchemists were criticized for, and the criticism mounted constantly, was of being frauds, charlatans, people who had no idea what they were saying, hid behind hermetic language or symbolism just to dissimulate their ignorance, and used their discipline to abuse naive people and make money without ever producing conclusive results. In the 18th century, there was still a place for alchemists, but bit by bit they were expelled from scientific circles, and the definition of alchemy in the general population was progressively restricted to the transmutation of basic metals, lead, into gold. References to eternal life or cures against diseases disappeared or receded. The rigid distinction between alchemy and chemistry appeared in the years 1720, and because alchemist was increasingly becoming a synonym for charlatan, the scientists enforced this distinction to avoid being discredited. This was the period when the modern, experimental scientific approach really finished to emerge, even though it had had precursors for centuries, as we have seen. Everything that could not be proven and replicated in an experiment was now outside the field of science, and the generation of thinkers that appeared in the 18th century enforced this rule, fighting against old beliefs. In the context of the time, the scientific approach had not triumphed yet. It is probably fair to say that it has today when it comes to research, but at the time, modern science was still competing with older belief systems and was still watched with suspicion by religious authorities wherever they were. Because science could come up with conclusions that contradicted not necessarily the scriptures, the sacred writings of Christianism, but rather the tradition, the view of the world that had been adopted along the centuries and had turned into teachings, sometimes into dogma. This is the reason why 2 centuries before, Galileo had gone into trouble for putting the sun at the center of the universe when it was supposed to be the Earth. And this lasted well into the 19th century. For example, Darwin was reluctant and at the start in a dilemma to publish the first version of the theory of evolution, because he knew that would be scandalous and mainly for religious reasons. Nowadays, mainstream religions have generally changed their approach and their relation with science. They have generally accepted the idea that the space occupied by science is not necessarily an aggression on religious beliefs or in contradiction to them. But it took time for science to emerge as an independent field, an independent space of research, to emerge from the traditional forms of knowledge, from ancient theories like alchemy or astrology, or from theology. Nowadays it is easy to make fun of alchemy or even astrology on the basis that they are pseudoscience. But what we should not underestimate if we take a historical look is that these disciplines, which are way more ancient than experimental science, were also the matrix of modern scientific disciplines, because they stimulated curiosity, they created emulation, they made new questions appear, they stimulated experimentation too. Anyway, in the 18th century, alchemy joined the group of pseudoscience or esotericism and was kicked out of universities. Ironically, alchemy did not turn lead into gold, but maybe modern science could. After all, 2 different metals are made of different atoms, but the particles within these atoms are the same. It would require a massive amount of energy and may not probably be economically viable, but theoretically it could be possible to rearrange the components of lead atoms, protons, neutrons, and electrons to create atoms of gold. It may not be exactly what had been imagined, but in this sense the Philosopher Stone has never been so close. It is just that chemistry and physics, not alchemy, have discovered it. We are not done yet. For our second story of the night, we're going to discover another ghost town in Japan this time, Hashima, or Hashima Island, but in Japanese, Shima already means island, as in Kagoshima or Hiroshima. On this very small island that looks like a ferry boat or a battleship, more than 5,000 people lived and worked 50 years ago. This once was one of the most densely populated places in the world. They are all gone now, and Hashima has become a ghost town where buildings up to 9 floors high are slowly turning into ruins under the very warm climate and the typhoons that are frequent in the south of Japan. All around the island runs a seawall that protected it and still protects it from the waves. So what happened? Hashima was an inhabited small rock for centuries off the coast of Nagasaki in the south of Japan. But its destiny changed suddenly when undersea coal deposits were discovered in the 19th century, and it became the site of a coal mine. You know that Japan started its industrial revolution in the second half of the 19th century. Japan is an unique case of a country that resisted colonization or foreign influence, and instead started a spectacular reform process to adapt its economy and its society. This period is called the Meiji era. It began in 1868, and it consisted in a peaceful and state-led revolution. In a matter of years, all structures that had existed for centuries in medieval Japan were reformed or sometimes abandoned. The country made a huge outward-looking effort to absorb technology, science, know-how, and it began a very quick industrial revolution, way quicker than what European countries had gone through, because Japan was catching up. In 3 to 4 decades, Japan became an industrial power with railroads, a big manufacturing sector. It sent thousands of engineers abroad to learn modern techniques. It also invited thousands of professors to Japan to teach a new generation of scientists, mathematicians, lawyers, engineers. Big companies appeared too. And the entire society changed from the structure of social classes to the clothes they wore. There are few examples in history, and it was certainly unique at the time, of a country going voluntarily through such a radical change. It turned Japan into an industrialized nation and probably saved it from falling under control of foreign interests, because the Japanese proved very good at playing this game that the Europeans and Americans had discovered a few decades before. One big limitation to the industrialization of Japan, though, was that the archipelago is relatively poor in commodities such as iron, coal, or other metals. Most of it had to be imported, which is why an obsession for Japan when it entered this new era became to secure access to these commodities. And this is one of the reasons why Japan became an imperialist power. But there was a bit of coal in Japan, and of course all available mines were quickly exploited to feed this constantly growing industry. This is how Hashima received its first inhabitants in the modern era. The exploitation of the coal resources started in 1887, and in 1890 Mitsubishi bought the island. The name Mitsubishi is known worldwide because of Mitsubishi Motors, the cars. But Mitsubishi was one of these groups of companies that became gigantic during the industrialization of Japan. The Mitsubishi conglomerate was dismantled after the Second World War, but it had interests in many different sectors: banking, transport, optics, heavy industry, aeronautics. And this huge conglomerate of companies started modestly in shipping, and it entered coal mining because it needed coal for its ships. Under the administration of Mitsubishi, extraction accelerated, and eventually 4 main pits were dug on Hashima. The mines were dug down to 1 kilometer under the surface. And from these vertical holes, galleries under the seabed allowed to collect coal all around the island. The size of the island tripled to accommodate more facilities thanks to land reclamation on the sea, and a wall was built all around it to protect everything from the waves. Space was also needed on the island for workers, and because the island was so small, about 16 acres, including the land reclamation, apartment blocks were built several floors high. In 1916, some of the first reinforced concrete buildings in Japan were built on Hashima. Typhoons are very frequent and destructive in the south of Japan, and this guaranteed that they would resist the wind or an eventual tsunami. The island's population grew constantly until the 1950s, when it reached a peak population of 5,000 workers and their families. What once was really just a small rock on the sea had turned into a very crowded town with 10-floor apartment blocks, a school, a hospital, a cinema, shops, even a swimming pool and rooftop gardens. All of this because the coal mine was producing. For the most part of the 20th century, life was really harsh for the workers. Japan had tens of millions of inhabitants and many poor peasants. Some of them became industry workers, but the salaries were very low until the post-World War II period, and working conditions were very harsh too, but not as tough as for the foreign workers who were forced to come work on the island. Starting in the 1930s, Japan forced conscripted Korean civilians and later Chinese prisoners of war to come to Hashima and work in the coal mines. This ended after World War II, but in the meantime it is estimated that more than 1,000 of them died on the island due to malnutrition, exhaustion, or sometimes underground accidents. For this reason, the history of Hashima remains a point of tension between Japan and its neighbors, Korea and China. Hashima lived only from coal, and it died because of it. In the 1950s and 60s, coal extraction declined overall in Japan. Oil was replacing it, and Hashima's deposits were nearing depletion anyway. So its population began to decline, and in 1974, after almost 90 years of continuing exploitation, Mitsubishi closed the mine. Hashima no longer had a reason to be, and in 3 months' time it was empty of inhabitants. Not a single person stayed. Hundreds of abandoned apartments and other buildings remain unoccupied since then. They have started to fall into ruins, but slowly, because they are made of reinforced concrete, and vegetation is progressively covering the island, planting roots in disaggregated concrete. The entire island looks eerie. There is no other noise than the ocean in thousands of empty rooms. There are ongoing talks about a partial restoration, or at least works to avoid the collapse of buildings, because it has become a site of historical interest. It is a testimony of Japan's early industrialization and of Japanese 20th century industrial architecture. But there is no plan to repopulate it. It would make little sense economically. and the weather is really unfriendly, so it's not a welcoming place. So this is all for tonight. I hope you enjoyed these two stories, and I will speak to you soon for a new adventure. In the meantime, you can close your eyes and let yourself go. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.